Hello everyone, welcome to this technical session on cluster-aware updates, part of the initiative which is from the Global Business Support Team and Microsoft MEA, Middle East and Africa. Let me introduce myself and we will start from there. My name is Nibin. I'm a Senior Premier Field Engineer based in Kuwait. I'm part of the Microsoft Middle East Global Business Support Team. I work as a platform's Premier Field Engineer working on Active Directory, clustering, and a bit of virtualization. This training is part of an initiative that we do within our Global Business Support Team, part of Microsoft Middle East. And I would like to, first of all, welcome all of you to this training session. I would also like to let you know that this training session also is getting recorded, and it would be available part of this Premier Field Engineering at the GBS team blog in Middle East. I'll share that information at the end so that you all have that blog information. So let's get started. As I mentioned, I work with the platform support team in Microsoft, and I'm with Microsoft for the last 7.5 years. With having a total of 13 years of IT experience. I worked on Active Directory, part of our support center based in India, and then I moved as a Premier Field Engineer. So that was a quick introduction about me. And today's session, we're going to talk about cluster-aware updating. As you can see that heading, it's a reliable and automated method of patching Windows Server 2012 clusters. So let's get started here. Let's talk about today's agenda. Today's agenda, it's a session introduction. Then we will go ahead with introducing the cluster-aware updating feature with different modes and plugins that we have with the cluster-aware updates. Then we'll go ahead with a couple of demos with CAU, which is cluster-aware updates introduction, and also how to configure the cluster-aware updates and make use of it in order to update your failover clusters. Then we will see the review of all the topics that we have, and then we can have a question and answer session at the end. Feel free to pop in your questions using the question and answer chat windows. I will continue with the discussions, and at the end I would be able to provide you the answers and we can pick it up. Okay, so let's get into the real topic. So today, the session, what we're going to discuss is cluster-aware updating. So before that, the session, why we had brought up this session to you, or what is the purpose of delivering this session? It's to make sure that it's a wonderful feature that we introduced with 2012. Now we need to make sure that our customers make use of it so that you can remove a lot of the pain areas that you have with the failover cluster patching and updates. So before even talking about cluster-aware updates, I wanted to first of all mention some of the challenges that I have seen with our customers who day-to-day they work with the failover clusters. One of the biggest challenges, even when I talk to them about what's your main concern, they always talk about patch Tuesdays are one of our concerns, especially related to failover clusters. So I'm sure most of you are aware patch Tuesdays, which is a second Tuesday of every month, Microsoft is expected to release some security updates and hotfixes. Now, when those patches comes in, our customers always have their security measures to make sure that these patches are updated on all the critical machines. Now, everything goes smooth, but when it comes to failover clusters, the admins really have to do a lot of tasks when it comes to the patching. For example, if I ask a traditional patching procedure of failover cluster, the administrator will tell me, okay, so I have a 5-node file server cluster. Now I'm trying to patch it. My procedures are going to be like, I take one node, which is my passive node. I patch the server. I restart the server, make sure that everything is functioning on that, then move the resources from another node, one of the active nodes, to this passive node, then patch that node, bring it up, and then I need to continue doing this exercise with all the nodes. So each node that I do, go ahead and manually move the resource. Then I need to track where I move the resource because I need to move it back. So it used to be it's a tough administration task for everyone, especially when it comes to these days where we have Hyper-V clusters, which is like 12 nodes, 16 nodes, 24 nodes. So you could imagine how much time you're going to spend being an administrator patching your failover clusters. And this all involves a lot of manual intervention. So for example, you're patching a 24 node cluster, and maybe out of 24, one node you might have missed it because it's all manual tasks that you're doing. So this being considered as one of the most challenges for failover cluster administrators, we introduced cluster-aware updating feature, which itself basically explains it's a cluster solution-aware updating feature. So that means the updating process knows that this is a failover cluster. So what I need to do in order to make sure that the update is getting installed on all the nodes and it won't affect the resources running on that cluster. So it's the cluster-aware update process, or the feature, is completely aware of how failover cluster works, and then it orchestrates the cluster patching procedure. So the orchestration is a term which you can call it as automation, right? So with the automation, what happens is whatever manual steps that you were doing before, you will just let cluster-aware updates to automatically perform all those steps. You being an administrator, you only need to configure the CAU just for once. Okay. Now onwards, I'll call it a CAU because that's going to be the easiest term. So you just need to have CAU configured for once, and that's it. It automatically updates the cluster on whatever schedule that you mentioned. For example, I have one customer who had scheduled it for every second Friday of the month during the night. Okay. And the logic behind that one, Tuesday, Microsoft will release the patch on every second Tuesday. So they have another 4 days just to see in case there are any issues with the latest patches. If not, they let their cluster to automatically update on the coming Friday, and the cluster gets updated automatically. They being the admins, they just configure it once, and that's it. It just runs fine. So that's the beauty of cluster-aware updating. And especially now, you all will have a concern. It all sounds good, and cluster-aware update sounds really interesting, but what happens to my workloads running on the servers, on the clusters? Is it going to have some downtime, or is it going to be like a smooth transition, or like a failover? So it depends on the workload as well, because if you have workloads that's like, for example, I can say continuously available workloads. Examples are Hyper-V live migration. There is a new feature that we introduced, which is transparent failover for the file server, along with SMB3. So using these, for example, if it's a Hyper-V cluster, it has the live migration feature built into that. So whenever one node is getting patched, before even it's patched, the resources are being live migrated to one of the other nodes. And this is done automatically by the cluster-aware update. So in this case, you're not going to see any kind of downtime for the end users. But if you think about like a normal, for example, you have a custom application that's on the cluster using some custom DLLs, and you know that failover of that resource will at least take 2 minutes to fail it over to the other node, then yes, that's going to be your downtime during this cluster-aware update process. So you need to understand what's the workload that's running on it. So in general, we can say it's no downtime or very less downtime, depends on the workload that's running. So that's overall why we introduced cluster-aware updates, and you're going to take benefit out of it. A lot of your headaches being the cluster administrator is going to be handed over to the cluster-aware update process. So it just runs smoothly, and it updates and orchestrates the update procedure. Okay, so now, where does cluster-aware fits? This is a big question, because I heard it from customers, yes, we introduced a new feature for updating the clusters. Now, the first question that comes from the customer is, do I need to change something in my infrastructure? And the answer is no. Because your existing infrastructure, by default, Windows provides two of these update mechanisms. One is the Windows Update Agents that's always available on any client machines or servers, and you can disable or enable using policies. And you have WSUS, the Windows Server Update Services. These two are by default solutions offered by Windows. Now, when the cluster-aware update comes, it doesn't need to be, or it doesn't need anything extra. It just fits with the existing Windows infrastructure. You don't need to buy anything extra because it comes along with the cluster. You don't need to have a special infrastructure requirements because it just works along with these two update agents that we have. So overall, cluster-aware update basically gets integrated into the existing Windows Update Management infrastructure. That's what you would see in the upcoming slides and even the demo that we're doing, because it doesn't need any kind of license, or it doesn't need any kind of activation. All what we are talking about, if you have like a Windows 2012 server which is having Failover cluster role installed on it, and definitely the cluster or the servers are going to be activated or licensed, that's it. Your cluster-aware update feature comes as a built-in tool. Now, what does cluster-aware update basically does? Okay, what's the workflow of the cluster-aware update? It's really important to know this workflow because this is what you, being an administrator, always do with the failover clusters when you patch them. So if you look at those steps, it talks about move the clustered roles of the node being updated. Definitely yes. Let's imagine you have a 3-node cluster. Now, node 1 being passive node, probably you first update node 1, and then you restart the server. Obviously, if the update requires a restart, you restart the server. Then you make sure that everything is working fine on that server, and then you move forward with the next server. Now, in the any cluster node before you update, even the best practice is to keep that node in the maintenance mode. And you might have seen the maintenance mode option. Whenever you go into the cluster management console, you right-click on any of the nodes, you have an option called maintenance mode, or basically it used to be a pause mode, right? So when you say pause, what happens to the cluster node is it's actually paused in a way that it won't take any new resources as a failover, right? So none of the resources are going to fail over to that node when it's in the maintenance mode. And we need to do that because we need to make sure that part of the patching procedure, we don't want anything else to fail over to that node, because we know that that node is going to be restarted. So we also need to put that node into maintenance mode, then install the updates, and then restart the node. So this cycle needs to happen for all the nodes one by one. So if it's a 12-node cluster, then yes, you're going to go through all these 7 steps to complete the whole update process one by one. Now, that's the same steps the cluster-aware update does. And let's see, in the next slide, I'm going to demonstrate a kind of a workflow, what happens with this cluster-aware updates. So it's an animated slide, so you're going to have closely watch that slide in order to understand the process that the cluster-aware update does. Okay, so here we go. We got 3 nodes here, node 1, node 2, and node 3. So I got a 3-node cluster, and I have some resources running on node 1. Those are the light blue icons that we have. Node 3 also do have one resource running on it. Node 2 is kind of a passive node. It doesn't have any services running on it as of now. So let's see when CAU, the cluster-aware update, starts the update process, what will happen. Now, cluster-aware update does have 2 modes of operation. We're going to cover that in the upcoming slides. But just to give you an update, the modes are remote updates mode and the self-updating mode. So we will see those in the details, but just for this demonstration purpose, I'm assuming that we have another server from where we are initiating the cluster-aware updates. So in this case, the cluster-aware update is sitting on another machine. Now let's see what happens when we initiate the cluster-aware update. So as I mentioned earlier, the cluster-aware update can always be initiated automatically. That means you can schedule it, or as and when you think that you need to update the clusters, you can also initiate it manually. So here in this case, let's assume we are initiating it manually. So let's see what happens. The moment when the cluster-aware update is initiated, it picks up one of the nodes, and in this case, let's assume it picked up node 1. Okay, so it selected node 1, and then the first thing that it does is it put the node into maintenance mode. That's kind of a safety precaution, because we need to make sure that nothing fails over to that node while we are performing the patching. It puts into maintenance mode. The next step is move the resources from that node to one of the available nodes. And it just moved the resources to node 2. Looks absolutely fine. Now that server actually contacts whichever the agent that it has been asked to contact. So it might be either updated using Windows Update so that it has an internet connection and it connects to update.microsoft.com and it downloads the updates from there, or you have a WSUS infrastructure in place so that it contacts the WSUS server and gets the update from there. It downloads the updates and yes, restart if required. Again, it's all automatic. You don't need to do any manual intervention, because if the patches that was installed requires restart, then yes, it automatically restarts the server. Okay. And then once it comes back and everything seems to be normal, then it takes the node out of the maintenance mode. Okay. So now node 1 is out of the maintenance, and the next step, what it does, it fails over the resources or fail back the resources to this node, so that the resources that were previously running on node 1 is back on node 1 again. So now what it can do is everything looks good with node 1. So we're going to start focusing on node 2. As the next step, it keeps node 2 in the maintenance mode and the process continue from there. So this is the overall this is the way how the cluster-aware update does the patching without interrupting the workloads that's running on the clusters. And as I mentioned, if you conserve some of those continuously available features like live migration queuing of virtual machines, then the priority of virtual machines, all works well with the cluster-aware updates, so that it prioritizes the virtual machines to move to the other node. It picks the right node with the available resources. So everything is integrated. All those cluster intelligence is being utilized by the cluster-aware update feature. So it just works seamlessly and without any interaction from your ends, being the administrator. Okay, so with that said, we just got an introduction about what cluster-aware update basically does and what is the workflow that it goes through. So now it's the step for us to install and launch the cluster-aware updates, which we will also do it in the demo. So what's the installation procedure for cluster-aware update? Do I need something extra? Do I need to buy something? As I mentioned earlier, you don't need to buy anything extra because it comes as an inbuilt feature. It just gets installed part of the failover clustering role. But if you wanted to go ahead with the remote update, so that means you wanted to always initiate the updates from a remote server, then you have to install the failover cluster management tools on that server. So part of it, the cluster-aware update gets installed. You could launch the cluster-aware update from the server manager. So let me show you that. If you open the server manager on a Windows Server 2012 cluster node, you could see under the tools, cluster-aware updates as one of the features or one of the tools that's available. You could also initiate this from the failover cluster manager, and that's what I've shown here in the second picture. I have the cluster opens, and on the right hand side, almost at the bottom, it's cluster-aware updates. That's the feature that's listed there. And either way you initiate the cluster-aware update tool, this is what the tool that you're going to get. So This is the snap-in, which is basically used for even configuring the cluster-aware updates and even performing an updates. And everything is done through this console. So this is kind of the heart of cluster-aware updates. And it got a rich PowerShell commandlets in the backend. So you can script it, you can customize, like there are some parameters that you can provide with the PowerShell commandlets. So PowerShell provides a big support for this cluster-aware update feature, and there's a list of PowerShell commandlets that's available. Okay, with that said, we're going to get into our first demonstration, the first sites of CAU. We want to see how Cau, I call it as Cau or CAU, so how CAU works. So let me get into one of my virtual machines, and let me show you the first site of CAU. Okay, so I'd like to first of all introduce you my failover cluster infrastructure. I got 3 nodes. All 3 are Windows Server 2012. And as you can see, the nodes that are listed here, Node 1, Node 2, and Node 3. Those are the 3 nodes that I have. And the service that's running on this one is a highly available file server. And the reason I mentioned a highly available file server, let me show you how it looks like. So if I look at the shares that I created, and this is a new feature in Windows Server 2012 along with SMB3, Server Message Block 3. As you can see, I created a share under the highly available file server cluster, and I have an option here, continuously available. That continuous availability, I've enabled it yes. So what this feature basically does is, imagine your client is connected to this network share and copying a big file. Now, during that copy process, imagine if the workload or the cluster resource, which is a highly available file server, failed over to the other node. Now, in the previous situations, imagine it was Windows XP machine connecting to the cluster and downloading this big file. You're going to get an error message the moment when this failover happens, telling that the network path not found. Because during the time of that failure, it loses the connectivity, and the SMB protocol is going to give you that error message. But with the continuous availability file server, when that failover happens, the client is intelligent enough, because SMB3 is intelligent enough to understand that failover, and it just waits a few minutes, not even a few minutes, a few seconds, and it just continues to access the same file through the other node where it got failed over. So in order to demonstrate this high availability during the cluster-aware update, that's why I particularly selected this continuous availability file share. So I got 3 nodes, and all 3 nodes running up, and all 3 looks to be fine. So now what we're going to look at here is the cluster-aware update feature. Okay. So let's first initiate the cluster-aware update console. Let me open that one. That's initiated from the failover cluster management snap-in. And as you can see, the cluster-aware update feature, it just opens up and it connects to your cluster node because it knows that the snap-in was opened on the cluster itself. So it connects to the cluster, but you always have an option to type the cluster name here, or you could also, if it was previously detected, you can also find it from the drop-down list. So in my case, my cluster name is cluster 1, so absolutely fine. I'm good with it got connected, and it lists me the 3 nodes that it has, node 1, node 2, and node 3, and it shows me the last run status as succeeded. Because I previously tested something, that's the reason it says that everything was status was successful. So the last time when I ran the cluster-aware updates, everything was successful. That's okay. We're going to start from the beginning. We need to make sure that we configure it, and then from there we will start utilizing the feature. So before getting into the configuration, I would like to introduce you the console a bit so that you're much more familiar with the console. As you can see here, probably the first step that you can always look for doing is how much is your infrastructure ready for the cluster-aware updating feature? So there is an option that's available, Analyze Cluster-Aware Update Readiness, because it do have some prerequisites, and by running this test is going to be the most important or the most easiest way to make sure that you get the prerequisites being checked. So I'm initiating the cluster-aware updating readiness. So it goes through various tests here. One of the tests is it checks the firewall rules on all the nodes, make sure that the remote shutdown feature has been allowed in the firewall. Because after patching the cluster node, as I mentioned before, if that patch requires a reboot, then yes, that node needs to restart it from the remote node. And in order to do that, the firewall needs to be enabled. So the first step is always going to be, in order to check the readiness, is to run this readiness tool, which is part of the cluster-aware updating console, and you will get to know what are the current status, is your environment is ready or not. So we are waiting a minute here to complete this one, so that we will see if there is any kind of prerequisites that are not matching. As I mentioned at the beginning, cluster-aware update is only supported with Windows Server 2012 or R2, 2012 R2 servers. So as you can see, the first test that it does is failover cluster must be running Windows Server 2012. And in our case, yes, it's running in 2012. It checks for the .NET version and the PowerShell version. Yes, it looks good. Then it looks for the firewall rule. It checks the firewall whether remote shutdown feature has been enabled or not. So it validates that one. So it's a good step because it gives you the clear idea whether you are matching the prerequisites. If anything is failing here, that means you won't be able to proceed with configuring the failover cluster, the cluster-aware update feature. So it's better to resolve those, and it gives you details here. For example, in my case, I just got warnings. The first warning talks about the proxy is not configured, and in my case, I don't have a proxy because I do have WSUS, so I'm good with the connectivity. I just need an internal connectivity. So I can just safely ignore this warning. The second one, it talks about the cluster-aware update role should be installed on the failover cluster in the self-updating mode. I don't have anything installed right now, and we will talk about these modes in a minute so that you will get to know or you will be more clear about what this role is. But keep in mind, this is probably what I would recommend you the first step. Analyze the cluster updating readiness. That's always going to be the key task. Then you have options to preview the updates. This is another important factor. After you configure the cluster-aware update, you always can check what are the updates that the cluster-aware update will do for these servers. And as you can see, it's looking for the Windows updates. So if I click on Generate Update Preview List, what the cluster-aware update does is it checks the what are the patches that's pending to be installed on these servers, and it prepares the list of those patches, but it's not installing. So it's good to know. For example, you wanted to know how many patches are going to be installed during the next run of the cluster-aware updates. You can always come here and check that patches and make sure that everything looks good, so that next time when the cluster-aware update runs, it installs these patches on those servers. So here you can see I do have a security update that's will provide you the KB article and all those numbers here in detail for 2012. Which is the update title that's clearly mentioned. And it says that the same patch is missing on 3 nodes. And if I initiate the cluster-aware update, that's what it's going to start off with. Absolutely fine. So that's the feature called Preview Updates. Then I can generate reports. So whenever I want to, for example, for the month, my management wants to know what was the last status of the cluster patching. If you wanted to generate the report, you can always click on Generate Report, and then you can run the reports to generate for a specific period. So if I just click on Generate Report, it looks for that specific range and see how many attempts of cluster patching has been done and what was the status for those patches, whether they were successful or whether they were failed, and how many patches being installed. So it gives a clear indication on what happened with the last run, or how much ever runs in the previous months, you can generate that report. And you can always export this into a pretty good HTML format, which I have it exported already. I'll again export it in the desktop so that you get a quick view of that one. I just would like to close it. I would like to show you the export option. And then we also do have configure cluster self-updating. Before getting into the self-updating, I'm sure you will have questions about what are the different modes of update process, what is self-updating, what's remote updating. So now let's go back to the presentation. So this is just to give you a quick overview or the first sight of the cluster-aware update. Now let's go back and see what is the different modes of cluster-aware updates. We're done with our demo. Cluster-aware updates usage modes. It got two modes of operation, self-updating mode and remote updating mode. In the self-updating mode, what happens is when you configure the cluster-aware updates on self-updating mode, the cluster-aware update or CAU itself gets created as a clustered resource. So it gets created as a clustered resource and it runs as a clustered resource. And whenever you configure the self-updates, it'll ask you what schedule do you want to run the cluster-aware updates. If you wanted to run it on every second Friday of the month, you configure that one. And if it is in the self-update mode, what happens is one of the cluster nodes becomes the coordinator node. The coordinator node is the one who is responsible for the orchestration of the update process. So he's the one who will check what's the next node to update, update it, and get a restart of that node and moves to the next node. So he's the coordinator node. Now, another question comes up. If he's the coordinator node, who updates him? What happens is the coordinator node, let's say node 1, node 2, and node 3, and node 1 is the coordinator. When he finishes node 2 and node 3, then the cluster-aware update, the CAU role, it's a clustered role. So it basically moves from node 1 to node 2, and then node 2 takes over the responsibility and he updates node 1. So it's pretty much all automatic, and in the self-update mode, that's how it works. Remote updating mode, what happens is you will have another server which is not one of the cluster nodes. Probably you will have another member server which sits and it connects to these clusters and it updates the clusters remotely. We will see the details here. In the self-update mode, this is what it happens. The cluster-aware updates, one of the nodes becomes the coordinator, as it's shown on the left-hand side picture. It requires no real-time user attention. That means it's completely automated and it's completely orchestrated. You just need to configure the self-updating mode and that's it. It runs according to the schedule that you have provided. Yes, one of the nodes becomes the coordinator. It updates the others and it even moves the cluster-aware update role, the CAU role, to the other node once it comes up. It's completely automized. Some of the common usage scenarios for self-updating mode is that branch office scenarios. So for example, you have a branch office where you have a 2-node cluster where your Hyper-V is running and you wanted to automate that update every month, definitely go for the self-updating mode. So you being the administrator, probably once in every month you just generate the report, make sure that everything was good. You don't need to stay late in order to update those nodes, because you can schedule it in a way that every Friday night at 12 o'clock it updates the clusters. It's a resilient cluster updating. That means none of the workloads are affected. They are all failed over to the other nodes. So if the resources are meant for continuous availability, you're going to have that continuous availability. If the resource has any downtime during that failover, that depends on, as I mentioned earlier, if it's a customized resource or if it is not like a Hyper-V, high availability or live migration capable resources, it definitely will have a slight switchover delay. That's something you need to keep in mind. And in this self-updating mode, as I mentioned, the CAU itself gets added as a clustered role. So we would see that in the upcoming demo. remote updating mode. That's the second method of updating using CAU. Remote updating mode, what happens is you will have the update coordinator as a machine which is not part of the cluster. So it could be another member server, and you have the cluster aware update tools installed on it, and he's going to act as a coordinator. Now, it's always in a remote mode, it's always the administrator has to initiate the updates. Again, you don't need to do the whole update process, but you at least need to initiate it. It's not going to be automatic. The automatic one is the self-updating mode. It will be good for servers which are like server core operating system, so which doesn't have .NET or PowerShell capabilities. So if that's the case, you could probably consider using the remote updates mode. Common usage scenarios, probably the first time you don't want to introduce the cluster aware updates as a role because you're a bit scared, or you really wanted to test out the cluster CAU feature. In that scenario, definitely yes, you go for updating it remotely for once and try it out and see how it works. And as mentioned, minimal server core without .NET or PowerShell, definitely yes, you can make use of this mode. CAU plugins. There are two plugins that CAU offers. One is the Windows Update plugin, another one is a hotfix plugin. So basically the plugins means what kind of updates that you're going to install, right? So if you want like a monthly patching to be done, that's going to be taken care by the Windows Update plugin, because the Windows Update plugin talks to the Windows Update agent or it talks to the WSUS server. So it either talks to the Windows update servers in internet, or it talks to the WSUS server, and it gets you the regular patches. Now imagine another situation where you have some specific hotfixes. For example, you're working with Microsoft and they suggested to have some recommended hotfixes to get installed on the clusters. They're not part of the Windows update. They just need to be downloaded from some KB articles, and they need to get installed. In that case, you could always look for the hotfix plugin. And again, you don't need to look for these plugins because they are built in. You just need to select whenever you're configuring the cluster aware updates. You just need to select what plugin you want to have. Each plugin has some specific requirements. Windows Update plugin is pretty straightforward because it relies on the Windows Update agents, and the Windows Update agent knows that where it can get the updates, either from the Microsoft Update server, which is sitting somewhere in the internet, or from the WSUS server, which is locally sitting in your network. So, but in the hotfix plugin, we have some specific requirements. We need to make sure that the hotfixes are located in an SMB share, and we do have some specific security permissions required on that SMB share in order to update it. I'm planning to demonstrate both of these so that you will get a clear update, a clear info on how it works. You can choose what plugin when you kick off the CAU run. So whenever you initially configure the self-updating mode, you can select what you need to, or whenever you manually start a CAU run, you can always select what kind of plugin that you wanted to use. Okay, so now we are coming to the most interesting demo, which is CAU in action. It's very important to understand. Now we're going to see how the cluster aware update works with all these features that we have discussed. So let's go get into the demo. I'm going back to my cluster infrastructure. So I did analysis and I found that everything looks good. So now I'm ready to configure the cluster aware updates feature. I click on configure cluster self-updating options because I want my cluster to automatically update it on probably every second Friday of the month. So I click on configure self-updating. It's start with the wizard. It's the self-updating options wizard. It asks me, okay, now you have a checkbox here, and without checking that one, you cannot proceed further. And that one talks about add the CAU clustered role with self-updating. So that means the CAU itself is going to be added as a cluster role. And in order to demonstrate that one, I will run one PowerShell commandlet first, which is get CAU cluster role. So it tells me whether CAU is installed as a cluster role or not. I hit and it gives me an error because I haven't configured that yet. So it clearly tells the current cluster is not configured with a cluster aware updating. So that looks pretty good. We will test it again after we configuring it. So I'm ready. I'm okay with that. And I mentioned because it's a cluster role, it requires a computer object in the Active Directory. And yes, I mentioned that I've already created a computer object in the Active Directory because I pre-staged that one. I would like to quickly show you that computer object. So I go to my domain controller, just switching a bit. And this is the computer object that I created. It's +1-CAU. And you need to make sure that whenever you create this computer object, your cluster resource is having full control on this computer object. So always keep that in mind. For example, if I go to the properties of that one and look at the security, the cluster's computer account should have full control on this. So I have that ready. So the name that I used here is +1-CAU. So I'm going back to my node here and I say +1-CAU is the computer account that I created in the Active Directory. So you can go ahead and use that. Then it asks me what's my schedule for the self-update patching. I mentioned monthly, starting from today, and I mentioned do it on every second Friday. And I mentioned it's a time as probably 12 midnight, 12 a.m. So that's the automatic schedule for this update. And I click on next. Then it asks me what kind of patches that you wanted to do. So this is where the plugin comes in place. So in my case, I want monthly update using the Windows Update plugin because I want the hotfixes to be downloaded based on whatever patches Microsoft release. So I use the Windows Update plugin. But as I mentioned earlier, if I wanted to update specific hotfixes that I downloaded from Microsoft, just for resolving some issues, at that point I'm going to use the hotfix plugin. Here I have selected the Windows Update plugin, which looks absolutely okay. It doesn't require any arguments. I continue with that, and it has an option, the recommended updates, what you wanted to do. I'm not going to do for the recommended updates. I'm only going to do the important updates. I click on next, and it asks me the confirmation. It shows me the PowerShell command that it's going to run. Everything looks okay for me. I click on apply. I'm hoping the role gets added now. Once the role gets added, we're going to start testing the cluster aware updates. Okay, so now the role has been added. I click on close. The first thing that I would like to show you, I will run the PowerShell command right now, and it should show me the role that's currently configured. So it shows me that yes, the status, it's online, and this has been configured, and it's currently running as a resource on node 1. So that is very much promising for us. So right now, node 1 is owning the CAU clustered resource. I'm going to apply updates to this computer because I configured the CAU. Now, I don't want it to wait for the Friday. I just wanted to do it right now. So I click on apply updates to this computer. I click on next. This is going to do the cluster updates, which this is the cluster. And I just say updates. Now, before doing this update, I wanted to show you how the cluster role is going to fail over during this update and how it will affect the workload. So in order to demonstrate that one, what I have here is I have the client machine, which is Windows 8 client. So what I'm going to do is this is the file share that I have, which is the highly available, continuous available file share from that. So from that cluster, I'm going to copy one big file, which is almost 1.6 gig file, and I'm going to paste that on my client machine local drive. So it takes some time because I did some bandwidth control. So it takes some time in order to start copying this file. Meanwhile, I'm going to initiate the cluster update process. So we would see whether this copy is getting disturbed or not. I mentioned updates. Now the wizard is going to start the cluster-aware updating. As you can see, it's starting a self-updating run in the background. It's trying for that one. And we are expecting that all the 3 nodes. Let's click on close here, and you can see the progress. It's node 1, and node 1 is waiting because node 1 is the current coordinator node. He's the one currently coordinating the updates. Currently, node 2 is getting installed the updates. So let's look at the nodes here. You can see node 2 got paused here because it's in the maintenance mode. It's automatically done by the cluster-aware updates. Everything looks good, no issues. Currently, node 2 is getting updated. At the same time, let's look at the HA server role. It's on node 1, so that's going to be the last one who's going to get updated. So at that point, we are expecting some failover of this resource. No worries, we will come back to that. Let's look at the progress right now. So it's node 2 is scanning for updates. It's completed one set of updates that's installed, and then it's again trying for scanning just to see if it has any further updates. The specific update which was pending, it doesn't require a reboot, so that's the reason it didn't ask for, or it didn't go for a reboot. So that looks okay. So node 2 succeeded, and node 3 is currently installing. So I can see that node 2 is now available, and node 3 becomes pause. Again, it's all automatic. I'm not doing anything here with the roles. Now, probably this is where it's going to be interesting, because once I come to node 1, that means node 1 is the current coordinator node. Now my updates is done on 2 and 3. Then one of the nodes 2 or 3 is going to be the coordinator, and then they will update node 1. So I'm just waiting for that to happen. And at that point, I'm expecting some disturbance for my workload, because as you can see on the top, the HA file server is currently running on node 1. So that means if I need to update the node 1, I need to put node 1 into maintenance mode. And for that, I need to move the resource from node 1 to node 2 or node 3, whichever. Okay, cool. So now we are done with node 3, and we are doing the updates on node 1. So it's going to be interesting because node 1, it's downloading the updates, and now you would see entering the maintenance mode. At the same time, you can see in the backend, the HA file server is moved to node 3. So that's good. It's pending for updates, and it's now online on node 3. Let's see if it has any impact. So it's currently online on node 3. Let's go back to our client machine and see if it had any impact of copying the data. Okay, it went down, but it's continuing. So it hasn't even had any issue during this whole update process. But you would see, once the graph completes, you would see a dip where the resource was moved from node 1 to node 3, and that's what you can see right there. There is a dip in the copy process. The total speed was reduced because at that time the failover happened from node 1 to node 3. And let's see the status of the update process on node 1. It's completed. Oh, it's still doing for node 1, because once the node 1's update process completes, the resource is automatically failed over to node 1. As you can see in the backend, it's actually moving the resource now from node 3 to node 1, and absolutely looks good. All the 3 nodes has been successfully updated. Everything succeeded, and our file share copy is still progressing without having any disturbance with this whole cluster update process. That clearly shows how resilient is the update process. Let's come back to node 1 and look at the status. Everything is clean, everything succeeded. If I wanted to generate a report, I'm going to generate the report, and it gives me what are the patches that has been installed. I just need it for today, so I don't need it for the whole time. So I take it for May 14 to 15, generate report. I would like to export the reports. I call it as test 3. That's the CAU report that I've generated. Let me go back to my desktop where I saved it, test 3. And the report looks really awesome. It tells me what was the status of the node. It succeeded. What's the time the run happens? Definitely there was some time interval. This is the first run that happened today morning. So if I go down, I want to see the last run that happened now. That's here. It happened at 3:46. Everything looks good. All nodes succeeded. And it talks about what was the update that was installed on it. So it shows that the same KB article for all the 3 nodes. If there is any errors or failures, it doesn't have anything. Everything looks good. So this is straightforward, the HTML file that you can share with your management, and you can let them know that the update process was complete, it was successful, everything looks good and clean. Okay, so that was the self-updating mode of the cluster-aware updates. Now, the last demo that I wanted to show you is the remote updates. And in order to perform the remote update, so as it was clear on the picture, in order to do the remote update, you need a fourth server which is out of the cluster. So in my case, I have file server 1, which is just it's a member server, and it has the cluster-aware updates, the cluster management tools installed on it. And what I have done here is I've downloaded a specific hotfix which I wanted to get installed on all my cluster nodes, because I was working with Microsoft on a technical issue and they suggested me to install it on all the cluster nodes. So now I have that hotfix downloaded and shared in an SMB share. So the share that I have here is, let me show you the network share that I have. That's going to be right here. It's FS1 hotfixes root. Now keep in mind, this folder structure is something that's required, because if you look at one level above this root folder, there is a special file that you need to keep here, default hotfix configuration. I'm sure the TechNet article pretty much clearly explains this folder structure and how we need to place the files. So the one that I included as the last slide will cover that TechNet article, and I would recommend you to go and look at that requirements. But yes, I've configured them correctly. So I have the hotfix here, and I want to install this hotfix on all the 3 nodes. So I'm going to initiate that process. And for that, I click on the tools here, cluster-aware updating. And remember, this server is not part of the cluster. So I have to provide the cluster name, which is cluster 1. And I say connect. So it's supposed to connect to that cluster. And it shows me what was the last time they ran the update. Everything looks good. Now I'm going to ask to do a remote update. And for that, what I'm going to do is I click on apply updates to this computer. And I click on next. It gives me the options here in order to select what plugin that I wanted to use. So here I'm going to say hotfix plugin, because I'm going to install a specific hotfix. I don't need to provide an argument here, but I have to provide, once I click next, I have to provide the file share. And I'm providing the file share here, which is fs1/hotfixes/root. That's the file share that I have the hotfix that's downloaded. I'm not checking anything extra because this is for encrypting that file share for the security purpose, and this is for access check, so that it checks that only approved users have the permission on that file share. I click on next. I have the options here. I click on update. So now it's actually performing a remote update. So let's see how it goes. It says the cluster updating started. When you close the wizard, you can see the progress. I click on close. Okay, perfect. So it started. It's installing the hotfix on node 3. It's downloaded the hotfix. Now let me see. It talks about the it's restarting the computer, because this hotfix, what Microsoft had suggested me, requires a restart of the server. So if I go to node 3, I can see that, yes, I'm automatically getting restarted, okay, because the hotfix requires that, and it's restarting the server. If I go back to node 1, and if I check my failover cluster snap-in, I can see that node 3 is down because it's pending for the restart and it's down. So it's automatically doing that. Let's continue watching the progress. I'm going back to FS1. So node 3 is getting restarted. Once it comes back, then the CAU checks that everything looks good on node 3, and then it moves to node 2, and from there to node 1. So I really don't want to wait for that long while it comes back, and then so ultimately I wanted to show you how it automatically takes care of restarts, how it automatically takes care of moving the resources from one node to the other node. It's all automatic. You're not doing anything. You're just initiating this run in a remote update case. In a self-updating case, the cluster automatically initiates the run by with the schedule that you've specified. We'll come back and see the status maybe in a minute because we don't have much time left. But yes, this is the demonstration of the remote updates. We'll come back and see the progress in a minute. Cool. So that was the demo in action of CAU. Now I would like to take your attention to some of the additional resources that from where you can get some information about cluster-aware updates. Definitely, yes, we got some TechNet articles which talks about cluster-aware update overview and what are the requirements and best practices. We also got white paper on an example of patching SQL servers using the cluster-aware updates. So that's another one which gives you scenarios like SQL Server clusters, which are kind of complex clusters. Then we have some webcast which walks you through configuring steps of cluster-aware updates. And finally, I would definitely recommend you to go back and visit the Middle East and Africa Microsoft GBS, the Global Business Support Team blog, for additional technical contents, because we work with customers and we provide blogs and articles in that blog, in that MIA GBS blog. And we also have information about the upcoming trainings so that you can register for them and you can take benefits out of those trainings. Before getting into the last slide, I just wanted to check the status progress, how it's going on. It's still restarting node 3. I'm absolutely fine with that, because once node 3 comes back, then only I can do the patching on node 2. But till that time, my resources all looks good, and I'm pretty much happy with the process, how it goes on. Okay, so it seems node 3 succeeded, and node 1 is installing the hotfix. So, and it's restarting node 1. So you can see that orchestration, how it's going on. During this node 1 getting updated, let's look at the failover cluster snap-in, and I need to probably initiate it from node 2 so that we can see that the resource which was running on node 1 basically moved to node 2 or node 3. So let's try to find out that information, and probably that's going to be the end of this demo because I don't want you to wait for the nodes to just come back, because they are still takes a minute or two for them to restart. Okay, so we would like to see where is our highly available file server running, because it was previously running on node 1, and when node 1 was patching and restarting, now you can see that it's running on node 3. So with that, we are still successfully progressing with our cluster-aware update, and our demo is ending here. And let's get into the slide deck back again. This was the section I was planning for questions. I hope I definitely have some questions in the chat window. I'm probably going to look at them and revert back to you right now once I finish the training, because we are already done with the 1-hour session. So let me stop looking at the chat window and let me respond to you individually. I would once again like to thank you very much for being here and being part of this global business support initiatives from Microsoft. As I mentioned, there are a lot more trainings to come in and a lot more contents to come in our blog and in our sessions. So you're going to find you'll find it useful. So once again, thank you very much for joining this session, and hope you all have a pleasant afternoon or evening, depends on your timings. Thank you very much.